Hey, everybody. Good afternoon, at least where I am. Good morning, perhaps where you are. That's where our guest is. We'll have him here join us here in just a second. I'm so glad to be with you here this afternoon, slightly different time than we're often together, but I'm glad to have you here. And of course, many of you are watching this later. So as you might know, this is a chance for us to record an episode of our webinar, which we'll actually start that in just a second. But while you're here, just enjoy this, engage with us, ask your questions along the way. And if you want to say whatever platform you're in, if you want to say hello, if you want to tell us where you're from, we'd love to know that. And again, whatever questions you have, we'd be happy to have them. And with that, I am going to do a countdown and we're going to get ready to get started. So Marissa, we're going to start. You can start in 3, 2, 1. Employee engagement. Is it the Holy Grail? It seems to be the thing everyone wants to talk about. The question would be, though, why are we chasing it so much? Why does it matter? And what can we as leaders do to grow and sustain it? That's what we're going to talk about today on another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're with us live, you can start by saying hello, telling us where you're from. And while you're here, I hope that you will imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee, so that you can share your questions, your comments, your ideas. They will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode. And if you're listening to this podcast, that means you weren't here live, but you could be in the future, because all of these episodes, or nearly all these episodes, get recorded live first before they make it to the podcast. So if you want to hear them sooner, if you want to have the chance to engage with our guests, you can learn more about how to do that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast/LinkedIn, remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. And today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each masterclass is designed to help you become the leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or to get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And without further ado, let me bring in my guest. There he is, his smiling face. You'll know what I meant about his time in just a second. His name is Brian Hartzer. He is the author of this great book, Leadership Star, A Practical Guide to Building Engagement. See, I promised engagement. He is an experienced executive and leadership mentor who has served as the CEO of the Westpac Banking Group from 2015 to 2019. Earlier, he spent 15 years in senior executive roles at the Royal Bank of Scotland Group and ANZ Banking Group. He's also worked in the financial services strategy consultant at First Manhattan Consulting Group in New York, San Francisco, and Melbourne. He is currently an advisor and investor to several Sydney-based startups, including Quantium, a data science company. He graduated from Princeton and is a chartered financial analyst holding dual U.S. and Australian citizenship. He resides in Sydney, which is why I say to him, good morning, Brian. How are you?
I'm great, Kevin. I'm ready to go. I've got my coffee and really, really pleased to be here.
He's got his coffee. He's ready to go, and we're glad to have you here. And we're going to talk about this great book, The Leadership Star. But, when I introduce people, the introductions are always kind of the same, Brian. They tell us a little bit about who people are and where they've come from. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your journey, sort of beyond that, like sort of how did you sort of end up where you ended up in short form? Because I think we learn a lot about you and even about our own journeys by hearing others.
Sure. Well, there's a line I heard a while back that life is what happens after you make plans. And I think that's kind of applied to me. I grew up in Connecticut, went to work in a financial services consulting firm in New York. And I thought I was going to be a consultant all my life or something like that. My first management experience was managing an ice cream store during one that
didn't go
holiday.
So well, according to what I read.
It did not go so well. And the highlight was when one of my staff threw her apron on the floor and screamed, "You're a terrible manager," at me and stormed out. And
that is our guest today, writing a book about leadership and management.
That's it. Well, you asked about my journey. It meant that I just decided, okay, I guess I'm no good at this management thing. And so consulting sounded like a good answer. And then 10 years later, I found myself put into running a credit card business for an Australian bank, managing 1,000 people, and realized I guess I better figure this thing out. And I'm not a schooled leader, but I knew that it was something I had to get my head around. And I started out with this one idea, which was, well, if I can get the best people in that industry to want to work for me and create an environment where they do well, then hopefully we'll win. And so then I thought, okay, well, how do I do that? And engagement was starting to be a topic people were talking about. This is the late 90s. And so I started paying attention to people who were seemingly doing quite well at it, and trying to look at what exactly they did. And like a lot of companies, we used to have an annual staff survey, and the survey would come through and they would say, well, this year you've gone up on this and down on that, and communications is a bit better, but pay is a bit less, and all this kind of stuff. And after I think probably the second year of this, I said to them, okay, that's great, but what do I personally need to do? And they couldn't tell me. And I remember they just looked at me, and that just bothered me. That fine, we can think about engagement as a set of policies or programs that the HR department does, but as a leader personally, what do I need to do? And so I started paying attention to that question, and ultimately developed this little framework for myself that I could use to make sure I was spending my time the right way on that aspect. I mean, and to your introduction, obviously there's a lot more to successful leadership than just engagement, but I think it's a really important lever, because if you can get the best people to be in an environment where they feel emotionally committed and excited about contributing, then I think you're a long way ahead. And in my mind, you can argue about, there's plenty of statistical evidence that suggests that it drives better performance. And I've certainly seen that in my businesses. But even if you don't accept that, it's just basic logic that if you get people emotionally committed and wanting to work really hard and be creative, you're just bound to be advantaged. So anyway, that worked quite well for me. I was at this Australian bank for 10 years. Then I got recruited over to RBS in London when RBS blew up as part of the financial crisis. And if you learn a bit about engagement when you go to a company where I had about 50 to 60,000 people working for me who were all in danger of losing their jobs. And many of them had lost their entire life savings because they'd been encouraged to buy the stock in the company. So I walked into a pretty demotivated environment, had to learn a bit about that. And then a few years later, I went back to Australia for family reasons. And I started applying what I learned. I'd been teaching this framework to people who worked for me, and they found it really helpful. And it ended up becoming a fundamental part of the leadership program at Westpac, which is Australia's oldest company and one of the largest banks. And people along the way said to me, you should put this in a book. And I said, I used to joke, well, if I ever get fired, I'll write the book. And 2 years later, 2 years ago, just before COVID, I got pushed out in a regulatory issue that the bank had, one of those kind of fall on your sword things. And lockdown came along, and it seemed like a good time to write it all down. And
Right.
and particularly with COVID, I think the challenges for leaders and how do you motivate people, particularly in a remote environment and with all the extra stresses that they're facing, it just seemed like a good time to do it. So it's hopefully my contribution as someone who was an untrained leader and had to figure it out. Here's something people may find helpful. It's the book I wish I'd had 30 years ago.
We're going to talk about the book more, and we're going to talk about that framework that you mentioned a couple of times in a second. I put up that lower third with the question, why engagement? You answered the question in many ways, but and you kept mentioning and tying engagement to this emotional connection, which I think is so very important, which leads me to my next question. So, most all of the work from consultancies and from all of the smart people has focused on engagement as something leaders are supposed to do to create this or whatever. Like it's a leadership thing. So my question to you is this: even though I know you just wrote a book with the title The Leadership Star and the word engagement is also in it, is engagement about the leader only, or is it about the individuals? Or talk about that question a little bit. Like, it's chicken and egg, I suppose, but is it about leaders or is it about individuals?
Well, I think of it as trying to kindle a flame that everybody has within them in some way. And what you're trying to do is find a way to connect what's important to that individual to the external purpose of the organization. And so there's a couple of steps in that. One of the elements of this I talk a lot about is context, that people need to see what the external purpose of the organization is, and then they need to see how what they do all day contributes to that and therefore gives them meaning. But ideally, you also need to understand what's inherently important to that individual and how can you connect what's important to them with what they do. And so I think to me, it's all about, there are practices the leader can do to help nurture that connection. But you're absolutely right. In the end, it's about treating people as individuals and helping them make the choice that this is something meaningful for them to spend their time doing. And I guess that's my assumption, is we're lucky that we live in fundamentally pretty affluent societies, certainly by historical standards. And people have choices. And particularly at the moment with the Great Resignation and with unemployment where it is, people have choices. And so I think in that environment, people are going to make choices where they feel valued, where they feel that they get a sense of meaning, where they feel that they're developing. And so the job of the leader is really about putting those sort of conditions in place.
Yeah, I like to think about it as individuals choose to engage or not, but we as leaders can do an awful lot, as you've just described, that can help them choose, right?
Yes.
Help them make that choice, right? Help them maybe even understand it and recognize it, which I absolutely love. So you keep talking about this framework, which you call the Leadership Star, which is the title of the book. We're talking with Brian Hartzer, the author of The Leadership Star, a practical guide to building engagement. You said that you came up with this framework yourself. So do you want to say anything more about it? We'll get to the components, and I actually want to sort of poke in at each of the components a little bit. But like, how did you come up with this for yourself?
Sure. Well, as I said, I was trying to answer this question for myself about what do I personally need to do. And I started paying attention to other leaders in my company, reading lots of books, learning everything I could from companies externally, getting speakers in, talking to consultants. And I just started making notes of various ideas, really. And one day, and applying them. And after a couple of years, the engagement score in my business had gone up dramatically, and our performance had gone up dramatically. And one of my colleagues in another business said, "Can you come talk to my team about what you're doing?" And at that point, I didn't have a framework. I just had various things we'd been trying. And so I said, sure. And I sat down with a piece of paper and I made a list of all the different ideas that I'd picked up. And it was pretty much filled the page with this list. And then being a good management consultant, you can't have a list with more than 5 things on it. And so I started saying, well, that one's like that, and that's like that. And I drew lines between them and I boiled them all down. And I found I could turn it into a list of 5 basic things. And then I found with a little bit of work, I could make them all start with the letter C, which made it.
You didn't have to work very hard, in my opinion, to do that.
Well, you'd be surprised, actually. But it did come together. And then I thought, I don't know about you, but I've read so many books, and half the time I've forgotten them by the time I finished. And I thought, well, if this is going to be useful, it needs to be memorable. And so, okay, there's 5 things. There's 5 points on a star. I'll call this the leadership star. My idea being, I give you a visual metaphor. There's a star and you think star, right? 5 points. Oh yeah, 5 points, 5 C's. What were the 5 C's? And then hopefully that helps you unspool it in your mind. So I did that as much for myself, just to be able to remember it. Because a lot of these,
you had to give a presentation about it. I got to remember what I'm going to say in this presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, it was really as simple as that. I knew that if I didn't make it really memorable, it was kind of a waste of time. Because we've all read so many books and frameworks and everything, and you forget it all. So I just tried to make something memorable that I could carry around. It was as much for me just to carry something around in my head, so that when I was trying to think, am I doing the things I need to do, or if something's going wrong, what haven't I been doing? Oh yes, I needed to spend more time on this.
So everyone's got this mental image of the star. If you're watching, you saw me sort of clumsily hold it up for a second. And you said it's 5 C's. So
yeah,
I'm going to dive in and ask you a question about each of them. So you don't need to go into detail, but just like, what are the 5 C's?
Right. So the 5 C's are care, context, clarity, clearing the way, and celebrate. And we can go into detail. Each of them.
Yeah, we're going to go. I want to go into each of those.
They each have a subtlety.
Yeah. So care, context, clarity, clear the way, and celebrate. I want to talk about each of them. And so I think, we have a self-selected audience. right? We have a self-selected audience, Brian, because people that aren't working to be better leaders likely aren't here
Right.
listening or watching, right? So
Right.
I can say that all of us collectively probably would say, well, yeah, we have to care, right? Like we get that at some level. The question I have for you about care is, what do you see us missing? What do you
Right.
see leaders not getting here or falling short on around the care point in the star?
So, Kevin, it's a great setup. When I give this as a presentation to groups of leaders, I ask them a question, which is I say, how many people in the audience care about the people that work for them? Do you care about your people? And of course, everybody puts their hand up. And then I say, okay, that's great. Everyone, you care about your people. Terrific. Now, imagine that you weren't here, but instead I had all of your people in the room. And I said to them, do you think your leader cares about you as a human being? What percentage of the hands do you think would go up? And at that point, the same thing happens every time I've done this. It's really interesting. About 2/3 of the hands immediately go up. And then there's a giggle or a sort of nervous laugh. And then another 10 or 15% of the hands stick up. And then there's 20% of the people who just don't put their hand up. And I say, okay, well, isn't that interesting? You've told me that you care about your people, and I believe you, but your people don't perceive that. Why is that? Well, it's because care is an action verb. It's not just a state of being. What steps do you take? Do you know their name? Do you know their partner's name? Do you know what they like about their job? Do you know what they hate about their job? Do you know what they'd like to be doing more of where they feel like they're not contributing as much as they could? Do you know what they do outside of work? And when's the last time you actually asked? And so it's starting to demonstrate that you have to take a genuine interest. That's the first piece. And the fact that it's about the individual human being, not just the generic caring about human resources.
Well, yeah, it's not
the
just,
key
well,
piece.
people are our most important asset. Well, okay, right? Yeah,
Right.
I love that. It's would I love that phrase, and in fact, I won't be surprised if that becomes the quote that we create for you here. Care is an action verb, not a state of being. I absolutely love
Yeah.
that. So I
Yeah.
think what we're missing is, do people know? Right? Do people
Well,
know?
it's do people know? And then do you take action? Do you take action to help them be better? Do you take action that reflects their personal circumstances? When we talk about flexibility, work from home, part of that is about each individual has their own challenges, their own struggles, their own things they're dealing with. So are you adapting in a way within reason that helps them be their best and that they feel like you're taking a genuine interest in them? And also, but there's a subtlety, there's a hard edge to this, which is, are you giving them feedback that makes them better? Because I like to say, you're not caring about people if you're not telling them where they fall short. Now, they have to believe you're genuinely doing that with their best interest in mind. So you have to build the relationship that allows you to have that difficult conversation. But it's not just about being nice to people. It's not just, how are you in the morning and how was your weekend? It's taking a real interest in taking actions that show you want people to be their best. And if you do that, they tend to feel valued, and that goes a long way. And I think that's the if there's one thing to remember out of this, it's probably that.
Another C for you, everybody, and that's coaching. I mean, basically what Brian is just talking about here is coaching as it
Yeah.
relates to and is connected to, and we all know that the people who have been most successful in coaching us in our lives, careers, are people that we know care about us, because we're much more likely to hear that feedback from them because we know that their intentions are in our best interest, right? You were talking already sort of earlier, we were talking about context, and I almost put
Yes.
this next bullet up because, and you've really kind of already answered this question about why context matters so much. I want to make an observation, then you can add to that. Earlier this week, in terms of those of you here live, I interviewed Dr. Ranjay Gulati, who wrote a book called Deep Purpose, and he and I were talking about purpose. And so for all of you on the podcast, I think I didn't have it because this just came up. I think it was last week's, but you can find it, and I hope that you will listen to it as well. We talked about purpose and the connection of that to context, right? And even the fact that that's a huge component of why people choose to engage. So you want to say any more about context, or do you want to connect it to that point about
Yeah,
purpose?
well, a lot of companies talk about mission and values and vision. I actually like the word purpose. I think that it's more action oriented, and it is this notion of why does the organization exist? What impact is it making beyond making money? And maybe one of the subtleties here is that when you're a senior leader in an organization, you know that intuitively. But often people who are at lower levels in an organization, it may not be as clear what the impact is of what people do. And I think it's the job of leaders to make sure that you're emphasizing that and you're helping people connect their daily work with that external purpose. In banking, my little one of the ways that I illustrate this is I used to visit lots of bank branches, and I'd go in and introduce myself around, and I'd say, hi, I'm Brian. Who are you? And they'd say, oh, I'm Robin. I'd say, hello, Robin. What do you do? And often people would say, well, I'm just a teller. And I used to conclude that if someone told me I'm just a teller, then their manager wasn't doing their job, because they didn't understand clearly that actually they were the face of the bank to those
100%.
customers.
Ask people who the bank is. It's the teller that they walk
Exactly,
into.
exactly. And so you can't take that for granted. You have to be continually reinforcing that. You have to be bringing it to life for people. And someone working in finance or operations who maybe doesn't see customers, you need to work extra hard to help them understand why this thing that you do is really important to us contributing more broadly. And ideally then linking that back to people's personal values.
And I would 100% say that in our future world of work, which won't always have people physically together, that this becomes even more important. Because if we were having trouble connecting the dots for people when they saw each other every day and they saw the signs on the building and the metrics on the monitors in the hallway, like, it's harder now. And so we've got to work even harder to do. That's more important, I think, than ever.
It is.
The third C is clarity. Clarity. Yeah. And we can all say, well, yeah, as leaders, we need to create clarity. I'm going to say clarity of what?
Yeah. Right? So I break this into 3 categories. Role clarity, which is what's your job? What's the broad expectations of the role? How do you fit in? Who are you meant to work with? And so on. Then goal clarity, which is, okay, what specifically do you need to deliver over this next period? And there's a subtlety there, which is, what does good look like and what does great look like? And if you've got that clear enough, people can actually, my measure of this is, can people do their own self-assessment at the end of a period? If you give them 30 pages of metrics, that's not clarity, right? You've got to give them a small number of things, but you got to help them say, okay, this is the level of given where you're at, this is my expectations of what a good result would be. But by the way, and here's my favorite question to ask people when you're doing this is, what result, if you achieved it, would make you incredibly proud? And so you try to engage people in setting their own goals that motivate them, because they think, wow, if I could do this, I may not know how to do it, but if I could achieve it, that'd be really motivating for me. And that sort of motivation unlocks creativity and helps drive better performance, rather than setting a low bar and saying, right, you have to, sell 10 widgets or whatever it is. And then they get to 10 widgets and they're done. It's how do you build that into something that becomes self-motivating? Then the third aspect of clarity is behavioral clarity, which is kind of what it sounds like. But it's making sure people know what behavior is okay and what behavior is not okay. And obviously it goes with all of the above, that there need to be consequences. That if you don't actually follow through and hold people to account for what they need to achieve and how they need to achieve it, well, then it's not going to be as effective, obviously.
And you can't do that unless it's clear, right?
Exactly.
So like, all of this role clarity, goal clarity, behavioral clarity is all about, you use the word expectations. This is at the core of our role as a leader. And how can people possibly be successful if they don't know what success is? And you described it here.
And Kevin, one quick thing that I found practically on this one, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is that you can't delegate this entirely to the HR department. Is that people tend to spend a lot of time on reviews and not a lot of time on setting goals. And that it just seems to be the way it works in big companies anyway. And my tip is it should be the other way around. If you spend more time being really, really clear on what's important and what the goals are, the review actually becomes pretty easy because people know.
Yeah, they know. And here's the other thing about the goals, everybody. That's something that's in the future. We can do something about the future. The review has already happened. Can't change past.
Yeah,
It's
really
already
well
over.
said. It's a great point. Great point.
Right. I want to talk about the other two C's. There's a lot more in this book than those, but I'm looking at the time and I want to really just get those two, and then we'll sort of go on. And the fourth C is clear the way. And of the five, that's probably the one that people might not immediately have some clue about. And it really is about getting rid of barriers. So what are the kinds of barriers that you think you want to highlight for us right here?
So barriers can be obvious things like physical constraints, not having the right tools, not having the resources, the budget, or the rest. But the other piece here is there can be emotional barriers, there can be intellectual barriers, there can be political barriers. And the key point here is that it's up to the leader to ask and to take an interest and not to just assume that people can solve all their own problems. Part of the reason that you're in leadership is because you're experienced. And you may spot things.
You've solved problems before.
You've solved these problems before. It doesn't mean you do people's jobs for them, but equally the other extreme isn't helpful either. So it's asking people, so what's getting in the way, and getting people to show you what they're struggling with, because often you can knock something over for them. There's some things people can't solve themselves. A political barrier where another part of the organization doesn't want to help them. That's the leader's job to go and sort that out for them. So it's things like that. It's really about being curious, taking an interest, being willing to dive into detail occasionally, and then taking action.
You said something else really important there, I think, which is that we have to ask, because sometimes we don't know they're there, or they seem so obvious to us that they wouldn't need our help, which you hit on. But we've got to ask, what's in your way? One of the questions I ask my team members all the time is, what can I do to make your job easier? What can I do to help you be successful? What's in the way? What are the barriers? That's a really important question.
That's it. And Kevin, one quick thing here. I'm a bit politically incorrect on this, which is that empowerment and delegation is so trendy. And I actually think it's slightly overcooked, because it's led leaders to think it's not my job to take an interest in the detail. And that means that people end up getting stuck and spinning their wheels. And so I think there is a role to dive into the detail occasionally.
Well, and that doesn't mean that we should be able to do everybody's job, because trust me, my team most of them do not want me doing their job. But we've got to ask the right kinds of questions. We've got to be aware, and we've got to have enough context so that we can make sense of that. The last of the C's is celebrate.
Yeah.
And kind of much like the first one about caring, everyone says, yeah, we ought to celebrate. But how do we make it relevant and meaningful? Because I think too often leaders are afraid to do much of it because they're afraid it won't come across the way they want it to. And so there's a lot of cynicism, I think, around this. Talk about this one a little bit.
Yeah. So celebrate is really about recognition and creating a culture of appreciation, so that you create this positive spiral where people deliver what's been expected of them, that they're then rewarded for that in an emotionally fulfilling way, which makes them want to do more of it. And so this is the subtlety here. Is it's not about pay and promotions and the annual certificate or statuette. That's fine. Those things have that sort of formal recognition has a place, but it's as much about the informal things that you do. It's as much about team recognition as well as individual recognition. It's about creating peer recognition as well, and doing it on a regular, frequent basis. And it doesn't have to cost a lot, but it's about finding ways to single out what people have achieved and make sure they really appreciate that, or that they really feel appreciated for what they've done. I'll give you one little story to illustrate this. When my first job, 3 months in, my father rang me up and said, "I just got a letter from your boss." And I panicked, and he said, "Let me read it to you." And it said, "Dear Mr. Hartzer."
Before you go on with the story, I just got to say something. It's the same thing I say to people all the time about the word feedback. We hear that word, we're like, uh-oh.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And so the first thing you thought was, what did I do wrong? That is so true. Go ahead. So Dad's now going to read your letter.
So Dad rings me up and he says, "Let me read this to you." He says, "Dear Mr. Hartzer, just wanted to let you know what a great job your son Brian is doing and how proud you should be of him. He's been here for 3 months. He's fitted in really well. He's making a great contribution already, and we think he has a terrific future here, and you should be very proud. And, I was completely blown away, totally surprised. My father, of course, was over the moon. And I think it had a lot to do with why I stayed at the company for 10 years, because every time I would get, upset or think about leaving, my father would say, "Oh, no, remember, these guys are really good, da, da, da." And you think about that, and that was 30 years ago, and over 30 years ago, I still remember it.
He's
And
reciting the letter, everybody.
yeah,
So,
and it took my boss 10 minutes, cost nothing, a stamp, and yet had a huge impact. And I think it's a great way to point out that it's not about these formal processes. They have a place, but it's more about that human connection where people feel like, okay, I am really appreciated for this thing that I did, and I like that, and I want to do more of it.
Yeah. We've been talking with Brian Hartzer, the author of this book, The Leadership Star, a practical guide to building engagement. We've been talking about it. There's a whole lot more, obviously, a lot of practical ideas in every chapter for each of the C's. Brian has sort of outlined some of those as we've gone. And Brian, these episodes aren't supposed to be specifically about the book, right? We want people to leave with tangible ideas. And I think we've achieved that. And yet we haven't even gotten to a whole other section of the book, which talks about the inside of the star, which is ourselves, and the communication that runs around the outside of it. And I know we don't have time to do any of that justice, but I'll just ask this question. Is there one more thing we haven't talked about, or one more thing that you want to say that we haven't said?
Yeah, really quickly, people can spot a phony. And so self-awareness, authenticity, I think is really important. And leaders need to spend time making sure that they're really clear in their own mind about what they're about, why they have a sense of purpose that connects to the organization, what it is that they want to create for others. And if they're genuine about that, then I think that goes a long way to engaging people as well. And so my tip would be do the work on yourself, get a coach, get 360-degree feedback, whatever it is that you need. Go to the hard places emotionally if you need to that are holding you back, and deal with them. And if you get that right, that sets you up for success.
So thanks for that, Brian. Before we finish, a couple of questions is sort of shifting gears as we start to wind down. The question I like to ask smart, successful people is what they do for fun. So Brian, what do you do for fun?
I read a lot. I do some cycling. My wife and I have 6 kids, so we chase them around a bit.
Well, you don't need to say much more. Like, we don't know what you do for fun, but we know what you do is you got 6 kids. You got a lot going on with all those.
Yeah. Well, Sydney's a great place to live. We enjoy Sydney. The weather's good. The food's good. Come on down and check it out if you haven't been here.
All right. And so since you mentioned fun and reading, what are you reading these days?
Yeah. So I read a lot, all sorts of eclectic things. I think 2 books that are probably worth mentioning. I read something called The Code Breakers by Walter Isaacson, which is about some of the people who created CRISPR, the ability to edit DNA. I don't know a lot about science, and I found that really, really interesting. And then I'm a history buff, so I've gotten into another podcast called The Rest is History. And off the back of that, one of the presenters there wrote a book called Rubicon, which is about the Roman Empire and Caesar. And again, I was a modern history major, so I don't know anything about ancient history. So I've been reading that and really enjoying it.
All right. Well, thank you for that. So now I have a question for all of you who are watching or listening. It's the question, if you're a regular, oh, no, I got one more question for you first. The most important question of all, like, where do you want to point people? How do people connect with you? Anything else you want to tell people about you, the book, where they can find it, etc.?
Sure. Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so easy to find there. There's a website, www.theleadershipstar.com, all one word. And if you sign up there, you can get a free chapter of the book emailed to you. But you can buy the book in all the usual places. And there it is. And there's, this is the book I wish I'd had 30 years ago. So I've tried to write it for people to make it really practical, and hopefully people find some value in it.
I will tell you all that Brian succeeded. And this is a book that you ought to have a copy of. I think that if you've been with us for the last 35 minutes, you have a good sense of of who wrote it, and you got a lot of insights that are in the book, and there's a whole lot more there. I encourage you to go get a copy. And now, but other than that, now my question I have for all of you is this. Everybody, not Brian, he's done. He can take a breath. Now what? What are you going to do with this? We gave you specific ideas about things you could do at every turn throughout the last 35 minutes. So the question is, what actions are you going to take as a result? Right? What are you going to do differently to the action of caring, perhaps? How are you going to connect the dots for people to provide context and purpose and help them find that in their work? What are you going to do? We could go right on down the line. The question is, and it doesn't matter what I would say. What matters is what will make sense for you. Because at the end of the day, if you don't take action on this, what was the point? There's lots of podcasts you could watch or listen to if all you want is to be entertained. I hope that you were entertained, but I hope much more than that, you were challenged and you were encouraged to go out and try something to be a better leader. And Brian, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your ideas and your insights and being inspirational for all of us today.
Thank you, Kevin. And thanks for doing your podcast, because leadership is just so important right now. So well done to you.
It's my pleasure. So since we have been doing it, we're going to keep doing it. So next week, we'll be right back here with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.